I was standing in my own backyard, watching my kids swim, finally taking a quiet moment. We weren't loud, we weren't causing trouble, we were following every rule. Then an HOA woman showed up with her spoiled son right behind her. He pointed at me and said I had to leave the pool because I didn't belong there. People tried to explain it was my home, that I lived there, that the pool was mine. He laughed. He said his mom made the rules. Neighbors stopped, phones came out, people told him to back off. They didn't. What they didn't know was this: the man they were ordering around was the county sheriff. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. I was standing in my own backyard, watching my kids swim, finally taking a quiet moment after a long week. The sun was warm, the water was calm, and for once, everything felt peaceful. The kids were laughing, splashing gently, staying on their side of the pool like they always did. No yelling, no music, no chaos. Just a family enjoying their own home. We weren't loud, we weren't causing trouble, we weren't breaking any rules. We redoing exactly what every family in the neighborhood did on a weekend afternoon. I leaned against the fence, sipping my drink, keeping an eye on the kids the way any parent would. I remember thinking how rare moments like this were. How work usually followed me home in one way or another. How silence felt like a gift. I didn't know then that the quiet was about to be shattered by someone who believed power came from a clipboard instead of common sense. I heard the gate creak open behind me. At first, I didn't turn around. People walked by the fence all the time. Neighbors waved. Kids ran through yards. It was normal. Then I heard a sharp voice clear its throat, loud and impatient, like it expected immediate attention. "Excuse me." I turned and saw an HOA woman standing just inside my yard. She had a tight smile on her face and a clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. Right beside her stood her son, a teenage boy with crossed arms and a look of boredom mixed with arrogance. He scanned the pool like he was inspecting something he already hated. "Yes?" I asked calmly. She looked past me, straight at my kids in the pool, then back at me. "You're not allowed to be using the pool like this," she said. I blinked, thinking I misheard her. "Like what?" I asked. She sighed dramatically, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "During these hours, with this many people, it's against HOA rules." My kids went quiet for a moment, sensing tension even though they didn't understand it. I told them to keep swimming. I turned back to the woman and explained, slowly and politely, that it was Saturday, that pool hours were posted, and that we were well within them. I also told her this was my home, my yard, and my pool. She didn't listen. She didn't even pretend to consider what I said. Her son laughed under his breath and shook his head. "That's not how it works," the boy said. "My mom makes the rules." A neighbor leaned over the fence, confused. "This is his house, the NEI." Ugbor said. "What are you talking about?" The HOA woman waved her hand dismissively. "That doesn't matter," she replied. "Rules are rules." Another neighbor stopped walking and turned around. Someone else slowed their car. I noticed phones coming out, held low at first, then raised higher. People could sense something wasn't right. They could feel the imbalance. I stayed calm. Years of training, D taught me that raising your voice only feeds people like this. "Ma'am," I said, "you're mistaken. There is no violation here. Please leave my property." Her smile disappeared. "Don't tell me what to do," she snapped. "You're being very disrespectful." Her son stepped closer, pointing toward the pool. "Get out," he said, "all of you." Now, one of my kids looked at me, eyes wide. "Dad?" they wisp. "Arid, it's okay," I said gently. "Keep swimming." That seemed to anger the woman even more. She raised her voice so everyone could hear. "This man is refusing to comply with HOA regulations," she announced like she was reading a verdict. "If he doesn't remove himself from the pool area, there will be consequences." Someone in the crowd said, "This is ridiculous." Another person said, "Leave them alone." The HOA woman ignored them all. She was locked in, fueled by the attention, by the sense of authority she believed she had. Her son smirked, enjoying every second. "You think you're special," he said to me. "But you're not. My mom can fine you. She can make your life very hard." I looked around at the growing crowd, familiar faces, people who knew me, people who trusted me even if they didn't know exactly what I did for a living. I saw concern, disbelief, and quiet anger on their faces. I took a slow breath. I felt the weight of the moment. I knew I could end it right then by saying who I was, but part of me wanted them to see it, to see how far entitlement could go when unchecked, to see how easily power could be abused by people who never earned it. The HOA woman threatened to see all the police. She said it loudly, confidently, like it was a weapon. Her son nodded, already imagining the outcome he thought was coming. I met her eyes and said evenly, "You're free to make that call." She paused, surprised. The crowd went quiet. What she didn't know was this: the man she was trying to humiliate in front of the neighborhood was the county sheriff. The moment she said she would call the police, the atmosphere around the pool changed completely. The air felt heavier, thicker, like everyone present knew this situation had crossed a line. The HOA woman adjusted her grip on the clipboard, lifting her chin as if she had just played her strongest card. Her son straightened his posture, his smirk growing wider, already imagining himself as the win. Hour of a confrontation he believed was over. I didn't react the way they expected. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move toward them at all. I simply nodded once and said nothing. That silence seemed to irritate them more than any shouting ever could. Neighbors continued to gather. Some stood on their patios. Others leaned against fences. A few walked closer, pretending to check for air mail while clearly watching every second. Phones were now fully raised, no longer hidden. Everyone wanted a clear view of what was happening because everyone could feel that this wasn't just about a pool anymore. The HOA woman started pacing slowly, heels clicking against the concrete, narrating the situation like she was building a case. She spoke loudly, making sure the crowd heard her ever. Y word. She said I was defiant. She said I was setting a bad example. She said people like me were the reason HOAs existed in the first place. Each sentence was sharper than the last, fueled by the sound of her own voice. Her son chimed in whenever he could. He talked over neighbors who tried to reason with them. He dismissed anyone who disagreed as ignorant. At one point he laughed and said that fines were just the beginning, that they could revoke pool privileges permanently. He said it with confidence, like he had said it before and watched it work. One neighbor, an older man who had lived there longer than almost anyone, stepped forward and calmly explained that the HOA rules she was quoting didn't apply to private backyard pools. He even offered to show her the bylaws. She didn't look at him. She waved him away without a glance and accused him of interfering. Another neighbor spoke up and said this was harassment. The HOA woman turned on her instantly, accusing her of siding with rule breakers. The situation kept escalating, not because anyone else was pushing it forward, but because the HOA woman refused to slow down. I kept my eyes on my kids. I made sure they stayed calm. I made sure they felt safe. I joked quietly with them, told them to keep playing, to focus on the water and not the voices around them. Inside, though, I was taking in everything: the tone, the body language, the way authority was being performed instead of practiced. The HOA woman finally stopped pacing and planted herself directly in front of me, invading my personal space. "I'm warning you," she said. "You're making a huge mistake." I asked her, once again, to leave my property. I told her she was trespassing. I told her this conversation was over. I said it clearly and firmly, without anger, without threat. That was when she laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or an uncertain one. It was the laugh of someone who believed they were untouchable. Her son laughed with her. A few people in the crowd shook their heads. Someone muttered that this was unbelievable. She said she had dealt with people like me before. She said they always thought they were smarter than the HOA. She said they always ended up paying. Her son added that he hoped I enjoyed explaining myself to officers who wouldn't care about my excuses. That was the moment I noticed something important. The crowd was no longer watching. They were choosing sides. People weren't neutral anymore. I saw anger in their faces. I saw disbelief. I saw sympathy. The HOA woman and her son stood alone in the center, loud but isolated, surrounded by quiet judgment. She finally pulled out her phone and began dialing, putting it on speaker so everyone could hear. She announced she was calling the police to report a non-compliant accident. Her voice was confident, rehearsed, almost excited. As the phone rang, the noise around us faded. Even the kids in the pool went quiet again, sensing the shift. The HOA woman locked eyes with me, waiting for a reaction. She wanted fear, she wanted regret, she wanted submission. She didn't get any of it. I simply stood there calm and steady, watching her dig herself deeper with every word. She spoke into that phone. I listened as she exaggerated the situation, as she described me as aggressive, as she painted herself as the victim. I let her talk. I let the crowd hear it all. Because I knew something she didn't, and I knew that when this call ended, nothing would ever be the same for her or her spoiled son again. The call hadn't even finished connecting when the HOA woman's son, Deck. He was done waiting. He took a step closer to the pool, close enough that the edge of the water reflected off his shoes. He pointed again, this time with more force, his finger stiff and accusing, like he was passing judgment instead of standing in someone else's backyard. "I told you to get out," he said loudly. "You're not listening." His voice cracked slightly, not from fear, but from the kind of anger that comes when someone expects obedience and doesn't get it. He was young, but he had learned confidence from watching his mother intimidate people. It showed in the way he spoke, the way he puffed out his chest, the way he ignored every social cue telling him to stop. I held up a hand, not aggressively, just enough to signal distance. I told him to step back and lower his voice. I told him there were children present. I told him he had no right to speak to my family that way. Each sentence was calm and measured, the kind of tone meant to de-escalate a situation before it spun out of control. He didn't like that. He laughed again, louder this time, turning his head slightly so the neighbors could hear him. "You hear this?" he said. "He thinks he can tell me what to do. A fae." People shook their heads. Someone whispered that he was being disrespectful. Another neighbor said, louder now, that he needed to leave. The son ignored them all. He was locked onto me, fueled by the attention and the belief that his mother's position made him untouchable. "My mom runs this HOA," he said. "You don't get to talk back. You don't get to argue. You just do what you're told." He took another step forward. The water lapped gently against the pool wall, completely unaware of the tension hovering above it. My kids had moved closer together, staying near the shallow end. I could see their eyes flicking between me and the boy. I smiled at them, reassuring, even though every instinct in me was tracking the risk. The HOA woman didn't stop her son. She didn't pull him back or tell him to calm down. Instead, she watched with a look of approval, like this was a lesson she wanted him to learn by force if necessary. She kept her phone on speaker, waiting for someone to answer, her finger hovering near the screen like she was ready to pounce. The son started listing consequences. He talked about fines. He talked about penalties. He talked about making examples out of people who didn't respect authority. Each word sounded borrowed, rehearsed, like lines he had heard at dinner tables and meetings and decided were his now. One neighbor finally stepped fully into the yard. She told the boy to stop harassing us. She said this had gone too far. She said everyone was watching and this wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. He snapped back at her, telling her to mind her own business. He said she was lucky she wasn't being fined too. The HOA woman nodded along, eyes cold, like she was mentally taking notes. That was when I saw something shift in the crowd. The discomfort turned into frustration. The whispers turned into murmurs. People weren't just embarrassed anymore. They were angry. Not at me, not at my kids, but at the display unfolding in front of them. I told the son one last time to step back. I told him he was escalating a situation that didn't need to exist. I told him his behavior was inappropriate and that he needed to leave my property immediately. He scoffed. "Or what?" he said. "What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air longer than he expected. He looked around, waiting for a reaction, waiting for me to flinch or threaten or back down. I didn't do any of those things. I simply looked at him and said nothing. Silence can be uncomfortable for people who rely on noise to feel powerful. He shifted his weight. His smile faltered for just a second, then he doubled down. "You think you're better than us," he said. "You think the rules don't apply to you. But they do. And when the cops get here, you're going to regret this." A few neighbors exchanged looks. Someone quietly said that calling the police over this was ridiculous. Another person said they hoped the officers would shut this down fast. The son heard them and rolled his eyes, dismissing the entire crowd like background noise. I noticed his hands were shaking slightly now. Not much, just enough to tell me that beneath the bravado something LSE was happening. He wasn't as sure as he wanted everyone to believe. He had gone too far and on some level he knew it. The HOA woman finally got someone on the line. She launched into her version of events, her voice sweet and urgent, painting herself as calm and reasonable while describing me as stubborn and hostile. She exaggerated. She embellished. She left out every detail that didn't serve her narrative. Her son stood beside her, nodding along, occasionally adding comments meant to sound authoritative. He talked about non-compliance. He talked about refusal. He talked about enforcement. He never once mentioned the kids. He never once mentioned the neighbors. He never once mentioned that this was a private backyard. As she spoke, I watched the crowd. I watched their reactions to her words. I watched disbelief spread across their faces as the story being told clearly didn't match what they were witnessing. Phones stayed raised. Some people zoomed in. Others whispered that this was all being recorded. The son noticed that too. He glanced around and saw that the audience he thought was supporting him was no longer impressed. The confidence drained a little more. His voice grew Harper, more defensive. He tried to reassert control by raising it again. "This is what happens when you don't follow rules," he said loudly. "You get consequences." I finally spoke, my voice steady and clear enough for everyone to hear. I told him that rules without understanding were just tools for bullying. I told him that authority without accountability was meaningless. I told him he was Maki, a mistake that would follow him longer than he realized. He stared at me, stunned, like no one had ever spoken to him that way before. For a brief moment, the spoiled confidence cracked, replaced by uncertainty. Then his mother touched his arm, grounding him, pulling him back into the role he was used to playing. "Don't listen to him," she said. "He's just trying to intimidate you." The irony hung thick in the air. The sun straightened up again, but something had changed. He was louder now, but less convincing. He was pushing forward, but the ground beneath him was already giving way. And as the sound of approaching sirens finally reached the edge of the neighborhood, it became clear to everyone watching that the boy who wouldn't back down was about to learn a lesson he could never argue. His way out of... The sound of sirens was still distant, faint enough that some people wondered if they were imagining it, but real enough that the HOA woman's posture changed the moment she heard it. She stopped talking mid-sentence, her phone still pressed to her ear, and tilted her head slightly as if listening more carefully. Her son heard it too. His jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked down. The street for the first time since this all began. I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't move toward them. I didn't move away. I didn't gesture or raise my voice. I simply stood there beside my pool, the sun reflecting off the water, my kids floating quietly nearby. The chaos that had filled the yard minutes earlier seemed to slow, as if the entire scene had been placed on pause. "Neighbors, stop!" Ed whispering. Phones remained raised, but hands were steadier now. Everyone was waiting. The HOA woman ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket. She cleared her throat and smoothed the front of her blouse, trying to look composed again. The confidence she had been wearing like armor was still there, but it had a crack in it now, thin and visible if you knew where to look. "They're on their way," she announced to the crowd, like it was a victory. "This will all be sorted out shortly." Her son nodded, though not as eagerly as before. He took a step back from the pool, not out of respect, but out of instinct. He crossed his arms again, but this time it looked more like a shield than a power move. A neighbor near the fence spoke up and said this had already gone too far. Said that calling the police over kids swimming was embarrassing. Someone else said the HOA woman should be ashamed. She ignored them, though her eyes darted from face to face, measuring the mood she had lost control of. I checked on my kids again. I asked if they were okay. They nodded. I told them to stay where they were and that everything was fine. I kept my voice light and steady, the Sam way I did during emergencies when panic only made things worse. They trusted that tone. They always had. The HOA woman watched this interaction with visible irritation. "You're acting very calm for someone about to be in serious trouble," she said. I met her eyes and replied evenly that there was no reason not to be calm when you had done nothing wrong. She scoffed. "That's what they all say." Her son leaned closer to her and whispered something I couldn't hear. She nodded, then looked back at me with a tight smile. "When the officers get here," she said, "you'll want to be very careful how you speak. Attitude matters." A few neighbors exchanged looks. One of them muttered that this was unbelievable. Another quietly said that she sounded like she was enjoying this far too much. TR. Etched in an odd way. Seconds felt longer. The air felt heavier. The sound of sirens grew clearer, closer, no longer questionable. I could tell from the direction that they would arrive at the front of the street soon. I could picture it without seeing it. The turn, the slowdown, the moment they would step out of the car and assess the scene. The HOA woman started rehearsing again, muttering fragments of her story under her breath. She adjusted her clipboard. Her son stood straighter, trying to reclaim the confidence he had lost. He glanced at me, then quickly looked away. I noticed something else too. The crowd wasn't shrinking, it was growing. More neighbors had come out of their houses, drawn by the sirens and the tension. Some stood at the edges, asking what happened. Others were already being filled in by those who had witnessed everything from the start. The story spreading through the group did not favor the HOA woman. She sensed it. "Everyone needs to back up," she snapped. "This is official business now." No one moved. I finally spoke again, not loudly, but clearly enough that everyone nearby could hear. I said that no matter what happened next, everyone should remain calm. I said there was no need for shouting or interference. I said the truth had a way of coming out on its own. She laughed sharply. "Truth," she said, "that's rich." Her son added that the truth was simple. He said I refused to comply. He said I challenged authority. He said I thought I was above the rules. Each sentence sounded less convincing than the last. The sirens stopped. A hush fell over the yard. Even the birds seemed to quiet. Heads turned toward the street. The HOA woman straightened fully now, confidence rushing back into her expression like a tide. This was the moment she had been waiting for. This was where she believed the power would finally shift in her favor. Footsteps approached. Before anyone stepped into the yard, I took one slow breath. Not because I was nervous, but because I understood the weight of what was about to happen. I understood how quickly moments like this could become lessons, not just for the people involved, but for everyone watching. The HOA woman pointed toward me as soon as the officers came into view. "That's him," she said loudly. "He's the problem." Her son nodded emphatically, already stepping aside as if to give the officers a clear path. To me, I didn't step forward. I didn't raise my hand. I waited. The officers looked around first. They took in the pool, the kids, the crowd, the phones, the HOA woman standing in someone else's yard with a clipboard and an attitude. They asked what was going on. The HOA woman launched into her story immediately, speaking fast, talking over details, emphasizing defiance and disrespect. I watched the officers' faces as they listened. I saw the subtle shifts, the raised eyebrow, the glance toward the neighbors, the pause when they noticed the number of witnesses. I knew those looks. I had warned them myself. When she finished, there was a brief silence. One of the officers turned to me and asked calmly for my side of the story. I nodded and said I would be happy to explain. And that was when the HOA woman realized something was wrong, because the calm she had mistaken for fear was something else entirely, and the truth she had mocked was finally about to speak for itself. The officer's question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't aggressive. It was calm, professional, and deliberate. That alone caused a visible crack in the HOA woman's confidence. She had expected immediate action. She had expected authority to snap into place on her side. Instead, she was being asked to wait. I nodded and began to speak, choosing my words carefully, not because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, but because I knew exactly how much weight each word carried. I explained that my children were swimming in our own backyard pool during posted hours. I explained that we were not loud, not disruptive, and not in violation of any rule. I explained that the HOA woman and her son had entered my property without permission and refused to leave when asked. The officer listened without interrupting, eyes steady, posture relaxed. The second officer scanned the scene quietly, noting the crowd, the raised phones, the kids still in the water, and the clipboard, clutched tightly in the HOA woman's hands. When I finished, the officer asked a simple follow-up question. "Did you ask them to leave your property?" "Yes," I replied. "Multiple times." The HOA woman scoffed loudly. "He's twisting the story," she said. "He was confrontational from the start." The officer held up a hand, signaling for her to wait. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I'll come back to you." Hat was the moment her face changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for the people closest to see it. She was no longer in control of the conversation. The officer turned to the neighbors and asked if anyone had witnessed the interaction. Several hands went up immediately. One by one, people spoke. They described how the HOA woman entered the yard, how her son escalated the situation, how fines were threatened, how children were present the entire time. Their accounts overlapped, consistent and calm. The story forming was clear, and it was not the one the HOA woman had rehearsed. Her son shifted beside her, no longer smiling. He kept glancing at his mother, waiting for her to intervene, to say something that would restore order. She tried. She interrupted. She objected. She raised her voice. Each time the officer reminded her to wait her turn. Finally, the officer turned back to her. "Ma'am," he said, "do you have permission to be on this property?" She hesitated, just for a second. "I'm HOA," she replied. "That gives me authority." The officer shook his head slightly. "HOA authority does not override private property rights," he said. "Did you have permission?" "No," she said sharply. "But, and when he asked you to leave?" The officer continued. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I didn't think I had to," she said. The officer nodded slowly. "All right." That single word landed harder than any accusation could have. The HOA woman looked confused now, her certainty unraveling thread by thread. Her son stepped forward again, desperation creeping in. Oh, his voice. He said she was just doing her job. He said rules had to be enforced. He said this man, meaning me, was disrespectful. The officer turned to him. "Sir," he said calmly, "this doesn't involve you." The son froze. No one had ever dismissed him so completely before. He stepped back, color rising in his face. The officer then looked at me again. "Sir," he said, "for my report, I need your all name." I gave it to him. "And your occupation?" he asked. There it was, the point of no return, the moment where the truth could no longer wait quietly on the sidelines. "I'm the county sheriff," I said. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than anything that had come before. The HOA woman's face drained of color so quickly it was impossible to miss. Her clipboard slipped slightly in her grip. Her son's mouth fell open, his confidence collapsing in real time. The officer's posture changed instantly. Subtle but unmistakable. Respect sharpened his movements. Recognition flickered across his face. "Yes, sir," he said. "I didn't realize." "That's all right," I replied. "I wasn't here as the sheriff today. I was here as a parent." The crowd reacted. All at once. Gasps, murmurs. Someone whispered, "I knew it." Phone zoomed in closer. The shift in power was immediate and absolute. The HOA woman tried to speak, but no sound came out at first. When she finally found her voice, it trembled. "I didn't know," she said. "If I had known." "That's exactly the point," I said, still calm, still controlled. "You shouldn't have needed to know." The officer explained clearly and professionally that she and her son were trespassing and had been asked to leave multiple times. He explained that threats of fines and enforcement without proper authority could be considered harassment. He asked her for identification. Her hands shook as she handed it over. Her son looked around wildly, realizing that the crowd he thought would support him was now watching his downfall. He tried to laugh it off, saying it was all a misunderstanding. No one laughed with him. The officer issued a formal warning. He told them to leave the property immediately and not return. He made it clear that further contact would result in more serious consequences. The words were measured, but the message was unmistakable. The HOA woman nodded repeatedly, apologizing. Now her earlier arrogance gone without a trace. Her son said nothing at all. He stared at the ground, jaw tight, eyes glassy. As they walked away, past the neighbors, past the cameras, past the children they had ignored, the yard felt lighter. The tension dissolved. Conversations resumed. Someone clapped softly, then stopped, unsure if it was appropriate. I thanked the officers. They nodded, and F quietly, their job done. I turned back to my kids and told them they could keep swimming. They smiled, splashing again, the way kids do when danger passes and trust returns. And standing there, watching the water ripple under the afternoon sun, I knew that the moment everything changed wasn't when I said who I was. It was when everyone else saw exactly who they weren't. After the officers left, and the HOA woman and her son disappeared down the street, the yard slowly returned to something that felt normal again. The noise softened. The sharp edges of tension dulled. Neighbors began lowering their phones, though a few lingered, shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Conversations broke out in low voices, people replaying moments, correcting details, making sense of something that never should have happened in the first place. I stood by the pool for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle. My kids were laughing again, splashing water like nothing in the world had ever been wrong. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Children have a way of moving forward once they feel safe again, while adults tend to carry the weight of what almost went wrong. Watching them, I felt both relief and a deep sense of responsibility. Several neighbors came over to check on us. One apologized for not stepping in sooner. Another said they were glad someone finally stood up to the HOA's behavior. A few admitted they had been afraid of retaliation before, afraid of fines, letters, or quiet punishments that made daily life harder. I tend to all of them. Every story sounded different, but the feeling behind them was the same. People had been intimidated into silence for far too long. I told them something simple. I said rules are meant to serve people, not control them. I said authority means nothing if it isn't paired with accountability. I reminded them that no organization, no matter how official it sounds, has the right to bully families or threaten children. Heads nodded. Some people looked relieved, others looked angry, realizing how much they had tolerated before this moment. Eventually, the crowd thinned out, gates closed, doors shut, the neighborhood returned to its familiar rhythm. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. I pulled a towel around my shoulders and sat on the edge of a chair, finally allowing myself to breathe. My kids climbed out of the pool and wrapped themselves in towels, still talking excitedly about their day. One of them asked why the lady was so mad. Another asked if she was coming back. I told them the truth in words they could understand. I said sometimes people confuse power with kindness. I said sometimes grown-ups forget how to behave. I told them they were safe and that no one was allowed to treat them that way. That night, after the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, I thought about how easily the situation could have gone differently, not because of violence or chaos, but because of silence. If no one had spoken up, if no one had recorded, if everyone had looked away and decided it wasn't their problem. That realization sat heavy with me. Being the sheriff didn't make me immune to intimidation. It didn't stop someone from assuming they could push me around. What it did do was give me perspective. It showed me exactly how these situations look to people without badges, without titles, without a voice that others are trained to respect. It reminded me why fairness matters so much, especially when authority is involved. The next few days, word spread quickly. People talked, messages were shared, stories were compared. The HOA woman didn't come back. Her son stopped showing his face around the neighborhood. Meetings were postponed. Policies were suddenly under review. Accountability, it turned out, was contagious once it finally showed up. But the real lesson wasn't about embarrassment or consequences. It was about restraint. It was about knowing when to step back instead of stepping on someone. It was about remembering that respect isn't something you can demand with threats or paperwork. It's something you earn through behavior. That afternoon by the pool became a quiet turning point, not because of who I was, but because of what everyone saw. They saw how quickly entitlement collapses when it's exposed. They saw how fragile false authority really is. And they saw that standing your ground doesn't require shouting, only certainty. Life went on after that. The pool stayed open, the kids kept swimming, the neighborhood felt lighter, freer, more human, and every time I looked out over the water, I remembered how close things came to crossing and how important it is that they didn't. Because the lesson wasn't just for the HOA woman or her spoiled son, it was for all of us.